They said her shame was a debt that could only be paid in flesh. Her father, Mr. Way, a man whose respectability was a coat he wore over a core of cold stone, announced it in the dusty main street of Prospect's Claim. Aunt May stood beside him, a ghost in a tattered white Cheong Sam, the fabric a map of her fall from grace. The town watched, their eyes a collection of hard, glittering points of judgment. She was 18, and her world had been reduced to the space between her father's cruel decree and the silent, imposing figure of the man who was to own her. His name was Rowan, a farmer from the high country, a man spoken of in whispers as someone who kept to himself for reasons no one could quite agree on. He was not old, but his face was weathered by sun and a sorrow he did not share. Her father pushed a piece of paper into the farmer's hand. "She is yours, mister," Way declared, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "The debt is settled." Deputy Finch, a man who polished his badge more than his principles, nodded with a smug finality. "It's all legal and binding," he said, his gaze lingering on Aunt May with a possessive chill that had nothing to do with the law. Rowan said nothing. He simply folded the paper, his large, calloused hands gentle with the document of her ruin, and tucked it into his coat. He looked at her, just once, and his eyes held no cruelty, no triumph, only a deep and unnerving stillness. She was an object, a piece of property transferred from one owner to another. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, a bitter taste in her mouth. She had been cast out, not into the wilderness, but into the hands of a stranger who was himself a piece of the wilderness, untamed and unknown. He made a small gesture with his head, a silent command to follow, and turned his back on the town. As she took the first step away from everything she had ever known, a profound and terrible silence fell over the crowd. It was the silence of a community witnessing an execution of a soul, and doing nothing. We like to believe we would be the one to speak up, to challenge the paper authority and the public lie. But truth often arrives quietly, long after the spectacle is ended, and its work is slow, patient, and done far from the judging eyes of the crowd. The journey was a silent ascent into a different world. Prospect's Claim, with its noise and its dust and its suffocating judgment, shrank behind them until it was just a bad memory in the valley below. Aunt May followed Rowan, her worn slippers struggling against the rocky path. She expected a hand to grab her, to push her faster, but he kept a steady, respectful distance ahead. He moved with an economy of motion, his body attuned to the rhythms of the mountain. The air grew thinner, cleaner, scented with pine and damp earth. The sun beat down, but the heat was different here, less oppressive. It was a wild, lonely beauty, and it terrified her as much as the man she was following. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow that flickered at the edge of her vision was a new threat. She had been told stories about the men who lived isolated from the world, men whose loneliness curdled into something monstrous. She braced herself for the moment his quiet demeanor would break, for the mask to fall away, revealing the beast she had been promised. They walked for hours, until her legs ached and her throat was raw with thirst. Just when she thought she could go no further, they crested a ridge and a small homestead came into view, nestled in a meadow cupped by granite peaks. It wasn't a hovel. It was a sturdy cabin of dark wood, with a well-tended garden bursting with green life, and a curl of smoke rising from a stone chimney. Chickens scratched in the dirt near a small, solid barn. It was a place of order, of care. It was a home. Rowan led her to the front door and pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. He gestured towards a small closed door off the main room. "This is your space," he said, his voice low and raspy from disuse, yet clear. "No one will enter without your leave." He met her eyes then, and she saw it again, not malice, but a profound, weary sadness. He placed a tin cup of cool water from a bucket onto a small table. "Rest," was all he said, before turning and leaving her alone, closing the main door quietly behind him. She stood frozen in the center of the room, the silence pressing in on her. She walked to the door he had indicated and pushed it open. Inside was a small, spare room with a narrow bed covered in a clean quilt, a small window looking out onto the mountains, and a simple wooden chair. It was a room, not a cage. It was a promise of a boundary, the first she had been given in a very long time. The shock of it was a physical blow, undoing the tight knot of fear in her chest and leaving her trembling, not with terror, but with a fragile, bewildering uncertainty. The first days were a study in quiet routine. Aunt May woke each morning to the sound of an axe splitting wood, a steady, rhythmic beat that was the homestead's heartbeat. She would find a bowl of oatmeal and a piece of fruit left for her on the main table. There were no orders, no commands. Instead, Rowan worked, and she watched. He moved from the garden to the chicken coop to the fence line, his hands always busy, his purpose clear. He was a man who spoke through action. His silence, which had at first seemed menacing, began to feel like a space she could inhabit without the need for performance or apology. After 3 days of watching, of eating the food he provided and sleeping in the room he had given her, a new feeling began to surface through the layers of shame and fear. A sense of uselessness. She was a debt, a burden. One morning she rose early and went to the chicken coop before he did. She gathered the eggs, her hands clumsy at first, and brought them inside. When Rowan entered the cabin, he saw the small basket of brown eggs on the table. He stopped, looked at them, then looked at her. He gave a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. That was all, but it was enough. It was an acceptance. From then on, she claimed the chickens as her task. Soon after, she began helping in the garden, pulling weeds with a tentative care, her fingers sinking into the cool, dark soil. He showed her, through gesture, which plants were weeds and which were precious vegetables. He never stood too close, never let his hands brush against hers. He respected the invisible wall around her, and in doing so, he taught her that she was worthy of having one. He brought back a bolt of simple, durable blue cotton from a trip to a distant trading post she knew nothing about, leaving it on her bed with a needle and thread. There was no note, no explanation. The tattered white Cheong Sam was a brand, a constant reminder of her father's house and her public humiliation. She spent the next 2 days sewing a simple tunic and trousers, her stitches uneven but strong. When she finally put them on, the freedom of movement was a revelation. She was no longer a decorative, broken thing. She was a person who could work, who could kneel in the dirt and feel the sun on her back without fear. She was becoming someone else, or perhaps becoming herself for the first time. Her world, once defined by whispers and accusations, was now measured in the warmth of a fresh egg in her palm, the scent of rain on dry earth, and the steady presence of the quiet man in the background of her life. She discovered a small leather-bound journal tucked away on a high shelf, its pages blank and waiting. With a piece of charcoal from the hearth, she began to draw. She couldn't write the words for what had happened, for the complex feelings of relief and confusion that churned inside her, but she could draw the sharp line of the mountain peak against the sky. She drew Rowan's hands, mapping the lines and calluses, showing their strength as they mended a fence post, their gentleness as they checked a young plant for blight. Her art became her voice, a silent conversation with her new reality. One afternoon, Rowan came upon her sitting on the porch steps, lost in her drawing. She froze, expecting a reprimand, a confiscation of her one private joy. He simply stood there for a moment, his shadow falling over the page. She watched his eyes follow the lines of charcoal, recognizing the shape of his own barn, the curve of the old oak at the edge of the meadow. He said nothing. He just turned and walked away. The next morning, beside her usual bowl of oatmeal was a small, perfectly sharpened piece of graphite, smoother and darker than the rough charcoal she had been using. It was a gift of understanding, a validation more powerful than any spoken praise. The quiet rhythm of their life was punctuated by small moments of unexpected connection. A stubborn goat, prone to escaping its enclosure, led them on a comical chase through the meadow. Aunt May, forgetting her fear, found herself laughing as Rowan, with a rare, exasperated sigh, finally cornered the creature. As they herded it back, their eyes met, and a small, genuine smile touched his lips. It transformed his weathered face, erasing years of sorrow for just a second. It was a fleeting moment, but it felt like a turning point, a bridge built across the silence. She began to see the man, not just the guardian or the stranger. She saw the way he favored his left leg when he was tired, the way he would pause and look to the mountains as if searching for something, the quiet care he took in maintaining the small cluster of wildflowers growing near his wife's grave on a nearby hill. Her curiosity was no longer born of fear, but of a growing, tender respect. A summer thunderstorm rolled in from the peaks one evening, trapping them in the cabin. The wind howled like a hungry animal, and rain lashed against the windows. The sound was too much like the shouting from that day in town, the roar of the crowd that had condemned her. Aunt May found herself shrinking into a corner, her hands trembling as she wrapped her arms around her knees. The familiar terror, which had receded into a dull ache, returned with a sharp, piercing clarity. Rowan, who had been cleaning a tool by the fire, noticed her distress. He stopped his work and watched her for a long moment, his brow furrowed. The flickering firelight cast deep shadows across his face, making him seem both formidable and deeply sad. He moved not towards her, but to the hearth, adding another log to the fire, the crackle and pop a comforting counterpoint to the storm's fury. "The storm will pass," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't move closer, respecting her space even now. "It makes a lot of noise, but it can't get in." His words were simple, but they carried a weight of experience. He sat down in his own chair, not looking at her directly, giving her the space to feel her fear without judgment. "My wife, Sarah, she was afraid of storms too," he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. They reminded her of her father's rages. Aunt May looked up, startled. He had never spoken of his wife before. "She came from a town like yours," he continued, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Her father was a powerful man. He used debts and shame to control everyone. He promised her to a cruel business partner, a man who saw her as nothing more than a pretty bird for his cage." He paused, the silence in the room thick with memory and grief. "I got her out. We ran. We came here to build a life where no one could put a price on her. But the fear, it followed her." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "When I saw you standing there in the street with your father and that deputy, I saw her. I saw the same look in your eyes. The debt he claimed you owed me, it was a lie. I invented it. It was the only way I could think of to get you away from him, to give you a choice." He gestured to a heavy, locked chest in the corner. "The proof is in there. The deed to this land, free and clear. Letters from Sarah. It was all a desperate plan. A shocking one, I suppose. But my plan was never to own you. It was to set you free." The confession hung in the air between them, more profound than the thunder rolling outside. Every action, every moment of silence, every respectful distance he had maintained was instantly reframed. It wasn't indifference. It was protection. It wasn't ownership. It was liberation. The storm outside raged on, but the storm inside Aunt May began to quiet. She looked at him, truly seeing the depth of his character for the first time, a man who had turned his own tragedy into a shield for a stranger. "Sarah," she whispered, the name feeling sacred on her tongue. What was she like? A slow, sad smile touched Rowan's lips. "She loved wildflowers," he said, "and she had a laugh that could make you forget a whole winter. She would have liked you. She would have admired your drawings." A fragile conversation began, spanning the hours as the storm slowly spent its fury. Aunt May spoke of her own mother, a gentlewoman who had died years ago, leaving her to the mercy of her father's cold ambition. Rowan spoke of Sarah's courage, her resilience, and the life they had built together in this small sanctuary. They were two lonely souls, sharing their grief in the warm, flickering light of the hearth. In the days that followed, a new dynamic settled between them. The silence was no longer a buffer, but a comfortable quiet, punctuated by easy conversation. They worked alongside each other in the garden, their hands sometimes brushing as they reached for the same tool, a simple touch that now sent a flutter of warmth through her. She began to draw him differently, not just his hands or his silhouette, but his face, trying to capture the kindness in his eyes, the memory of his rare smile. One clear, cool evening, they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the deep indigo sky. Rowan pointed out the constellations, his voice a low murmur as he traced their shapes with his finger. "Sarah taught me their names," he said softly. Aunt May felt a pang of something sharp and sweet. She wasn't a replacement for his wife. She was a continuation of the love and safety he had created here. A cool breeze swept down from the mountain, and she shivered. Without a word, Rowan rose and came back with a thick wool blanket, draping it carefully around her shoulders. His fingers lingered for a moment on her arm, a touch that was both grounding and electric. She looked up at him, her heart beating a little faster. In the pale starlight, she could see the question in his eyes, a hesitant hope that mirrored her own. He slowly leaned in, his gaze searching hers for permission. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. His kiss was gentle, tentative, a soft press of lips that tasted of wood smoke and a quiet, profound respect. It wasn't a kiss of possession, but of shared sanctuary. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a rider, a boy from town paid to deliver a letter. The envelope, bearing her father's immaculate script, felt like a snake in Aunt May's hand. Rowan stood beside her on the porch, his posture rigid, his hand resting near the axe he'd been using to split wood. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The words were cold, precise, and utterly devoid of feeling. Mr. Way informed her that her period of rustic discipline was over. He had, through his great generosity, secured a marriage for her with a wealthy associate from a neighboring territory, a man known for his ruthlessness and his fortune. He would be arriving in 1 week to collect his property and finalize the arrangement. The letter ended with a chillingly casual line. "Deputy Finch will accompany me to ensure a smooth and lawful transfer." It wasn't a request. It was a summons. The paper was a chain, pulling her back into the life she had just escaped. All the air left her lungs. The mountains, which had become a symbol of her freedom, suddenly felt like the walls of a trap. The sanctuary was about to be invaded. Rowan saw the color drain from her face. He gently took the letter from her shaking fingers and read it, his expression hardening into granite. The muscle in his jaw clenched. For a moment he looked like the dangerous wild man the town whispered about. He crumpled the letter in his fist. "No," he said, the word a low growl. Aunt May looked up at him, her eyes wide with a returning fear. But this time it was different. Beneath the terror was a bedrock of anger, a fierce, protective rage for the life she had started to build, for the man who had shown her such impossible kindness. "I will not go back," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I will not let him take this away." Rowan turned to face her, his hands coming to rest gently on her shoulders, his grip steady and reassuring. He looked directly into her eyes, his own gaze unwavering. "This is your home now, Anmei," he said, his voice imbued with a quiet, unshakable certainty. "Home is a choice. You have chosen. We will defend it." In that moment, they were no longer a guardian and a ward. They were partners, a small, defiant outpost of two against the encroaching world. The threat was no longer a vague possibility. It had a name and a date. They had 1 week. The week passed in a blur of tense preparation. There was no plan for violence, only for truth. Rowan spent hours in the barn, but not sharpening weapons. He was organizing the contents of the locked chest, laying out Sarah's letters and the deed to his land with a grim precision. Anmei continued her chores, the familiar rhythms a comfort against the rising tide of anxiety. But she also spent hours with her journal, not drawing, but writing. She wrote down everything she could remember about her father's cruelty, the casual remarks, the cold transactions, the way he used his reputation as both a shield and a weapon. Her words were clumsy, but they were honest, and they were hers. The morning of the 7th day dawned bright and clear, a cruel mockery of the storm brewing on the horizon. They saw the dust cloud first, a faint plume rising from the valley floor. 2 riders, moving with the unearned confidence of power. Rowan stood on the porch, unarmed, his feet planted firmly. Anmei stood beside him, her journal clutched in her hand like a talisman. When her father and Deputy Finch rode into the clearing, the peaceful homestead was instantly contaminated by their presence. Mr. Wade dismounted, his face a mask of smug authority. "Anmei," he said, his tone suggesting she should be grateful, "your foolishness is at an end. Pack your things." Deputy Finch smirked, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "The girl goes with her father, farmer. We have the paperwork." He waved a document in the air. "She is his legal ward." Anmei felt a tremor of her old fear, the instinct to obey, to become small and silent. But then she felt Rowan's presence beside her, solid and calm. He did not move. "She is not going anywhere," Rowan said, his voice even. "This is her home." Mr. Way laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Home? This hovel? She is my daughter. She is my property. She will do as she is told." He took a step forward, his hand outstretched to grab her arm. Rowan moved, not with aggression, but with the simple physics of an immovable object, placing himself directly in Mr. Way's path. The tense standoff was broken by a new sound, the soft tread of footsteps. 2 figures emerged from the tree line. Mrs. Gable, the stout, no-nonsense owner of the town's general store, and Chayton, a respected native elder who often traded with Rowan and whose wisdom was legendary. They had walked all the way from town. Mrs. Gable held a small ledger, and Chayton's face was calm and serious. "We thought this conversation might need more witnesses," Mrs. Gable said, her gaze sharp and missing nothing. Mr. Way's face tightened with fury at the sight of the unexpected audience. His power depended on a silent, compliant public. "This is a private family matter," he snapped, his composure beginning to fray. "This is a matter of justice," Chayton replied, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight that silenced everyone. He looked not at the men, but at Anmei. "Speak your truth, daughter. Fear makes a loud noise, but truth carries further." That was all the encouragement she needed. Aunt May took a deep breath, the clean mountain air filling her lungs, and she began to speak. She did not shout or cry. She spoke with a clear, steady voice, holding up her journal. She read aloud her own words, detailing the years of emotional neglect, the public shaming, her father's plan to sell her into a loveless marriage for his own business gain. She spoke of being handed over to Rowan as punishment. Then her voice softened. "But it was not a punishment," she said, looking at Rowan. "It was a rescue. I found safety here. I found respect. I found a home." Deputy Finch scoffed. "A touching story, but the law is the law. The paper says she belongs to him." "Your paper is based on a lie," Rowan stated, stepping forward. He held out the deed to his land. "This is my deed, free and clear. I have no debt to Mr. Way." He then held up one of Sarah's letters. "And this is a letter from my late wife, telling of a similar cruelty at the hands of a man just like him. This isn't about law. It's about a pattern of abuse." Mrs. Gable then stepped forward, opening her small ledger. "I keep good records, Deputy. I know for a fact that Mr. Way was not owed money by this man. But I do have a record of Mr. Way refusing to pay the Chinese workers who built his new warehouse last year. He is a man who creates debts in others to hide his own." The accusation hung in the air, deadly and precise. Mr. Way turned pale. His reputation, the very foundation of his power, was cracking. Deputy Finch looked from Mr. Way's panicked face to the steady, condemning eyes of Chayton and Mrs. Gable. He saw the truth, and more importantly, he saw that the narrative had slipped from his control. The power had shifted. It was no longer two armed men against a girl and a farmer. It was two liars against four honest people. Chayton took a slow step forward. "The law of man is a fragile thing," he said to the deputy. "The law of the heart is older. You have heard the truth. Now you will choose what kind of man you are." Finch, a coward at his core, visibly deflated. He could not bully these people. He looked at Mr. Way with disgust, seeing him now not as a powerful ally but as a liability. Defeated, not by force, but by the undeniable weight of a truth spoken aloud, Mr. Way sputtered, his threats turning to blustering nonsense. He looked at his daughter and saw not a person but a reflection of his own public failure. With a final venomous glare he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away without a backward glance, leaving a trail of humiliation in his wake. Deputy Finch, eager to distance himself from the disgrace, tipped his hat awkwardly toward Chayton. "No laws broken here today, I suppose," he mumbled, before following his disgraced patron back down the mountain. The four of them stood in the sudden, profound quiet of the meadow. The sanctuary was safe. Aunt May felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. Mrs. Gable came forward and wrapped her in a firm, warm hug. "You were very brave, child," she whispered. Chayton placed a gentle hand on Rowan's shoulder. "A good home is worth defending," he said with a nod of deep respect. After their allies had departed, leaving them once again in the peaceful solitude of the high country, Aunt May and Rowan stood on the porch, the silence between them filled with everything that had just happened. The air felt lighter, the future wider. That evening, Aunt May took the tattered white cheongsam, the last symbol of her old life, and laid it carefully in the hearth. She did not watch it burn with anger, but with a solemn sense of release. Each thread that turned to ash was a word of shame, a look of judgment, a moment of fear, dissolving into memory. Rowan stood behind her, his hand resting on the small of her back, a silent, supportive presence. The fire consumed her past, leaving only the warm, steady glow of the present. When it was done, they went outside and stood under the vast, starry sky. The world felt new. "What now?" she asked softly. her voice full of a hope she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. Rowan turned to her, his weathered face softened by the starlight. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "Now," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we live." He leaned down and kissed her, and this time there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of profound relief, of shared victory, of a future chosen and fought for. It was the promise of 1,000 quiet mornings, of a life built not on paper or on law, but on the unshakable foundation of kindness and courage. It was the beginning of everything.